Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Ever since I was, I don't know, maybe even before my teens, I've always been fascinated with the human mind, with the way people behave, the way they think, why they behave the way they do. And I actually, for a very long time, planned on becoming a counselor until I changed my mind and became a podcaster. So, anyways, I looked into having somebody come on that could talk to us about the history of psychology, and I what I found was someone who could talk about the history of psychiatry, and I was just as intrigued, so I decided to have him on here. He's a professor and chair, and I hope I pronounced this right, at the Van Hannick History
Hannick,
Department. He's
Van
also
Hannick.
the director of the Max Kade Institute for Austrian-German-Swiss Studies, University of Southern California. Professor Paul Lerner, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
So I guess the first thing to talk about really, before we can have a history of psychiatry, is what is psychiatry?
Sure. So the important thing to remember about psychiatry is that it's a branch of medicine. So when we're talking about psychiatry, we're talking about medical approaches to dealing with what we think of as mental illness, emotional distress, trauma, other kinds of things that we understand as mental illness. And I'm saying it like that with a couple of levels of remove because, as you mentioned, I'm a historian and I understand everything historically and in historical context. And this is where we are as a culture, as a society, and where we've been over the last couple hundred years. But until around 1800, there really wasn't consensus that, again, what we think of as mental illness really should be dealt with primarily by doctors, or that hospitalization or pharmaceutical interventions, that these were as administered by medical professionals, that this was the appropriate treatment for those conditions. So where, over the last 220 years or so, there's been pretty much consensus that there is a thing called mental illness. And of course, there are many different ways of categorizing, of dividing, of diagnosing, of understanding their progression and cause and origin and how they're best treated. But in as much as we do have a consensus about those things, psychiatry is the branch of medicine that is charged with taking care of those patients and treating those conditions.
So I read that, like you said, psychiatry began to emerge. I read in the late 18th century, so it's around 1800. And it said there were three factors that were responsible for its emergence. The first one was looking at the mind as an entity. The second was an increased focus on mechanistic understandings of disease, and the third was the rise of asylums. First of all, would that be accurate that those three factors were fundamental to the emergence of psychiatry?
Yes, although I don't know if they're all causes or if they accompany I hadn't really thought about it that way. So I'll offer a slightly different way of approaching it, but not really in great contradiction at all with what you said, which is that absolutely psychiatry emerged around 1800, although it wasn't called that yet. That came just a little bit later. But the consensus that well, let's say, okay, so there were places to put patients. Again, I'm choosing my words very carefully because even calling them patients says that they're in a medical system and getting medical care. So, people considered mentally ill were housed in something that resembled asylums before this period. But around the early 1800s, a little bit before then, in the French and British cases, you have this new phenomenon of doctors taking over the management of asylums, right? So then they start to go from being asylums to being mental hospitals. Keyword hospital had become something that's understood, that kind of fits into the medical establishment. And along with that, of course, there are changes in the understanding of the relationship between the mind and the body, and whether the mind, or let's put it this way, where does the mind sit? Does the mind, the idea that we have, which is that the mind is based in the brain, that is again not something that's a relatively recent, in historical terms, a relatively recent approach. And that also we are, as sort of Western medicine approaches it, we have bodies and we have minds, and they are, or let me put it this way, we have a sort of material basis in our physical body, and then we have a kind of ethereal, or you might say spiritual, or some kind of non-material thing, which is either you can think about that religiously or psychologically or spiritually or intellectually or however, but that these are kind of different systems, right? And do we treat the mind and its maladies as, now is it, let's just say, and I know I'm giving you a very long answer and jumping ahead, but this is the kind of stuff I talk about with my students. If you have the flu or if you break an arm, in either of those two cases, things are pretty clear, right? You will go, you will, or let's say, on less pleasantly, maybe even you are diagnosed with cancer. You see your oncologist and you might start a regimen of chemotherapy or radiation, and you'll be managed by a medical professional or a team of medical professionals. But these things get a little different when it comes to psychiatry, right, and mental illness, because if you're diagnosed with cancer or you break an arm or you have the flu or something, that does, it might mess with your perception, it might mess with your cognition on some level, right? But the place where you reside, as a kind of spiritual being, that's not affected. But what if you have schizophrenia, right? Or obsessive compulsive disorder or manic depression? Then the you who understands the condition is very much entangled in the condition itself, right? You don't have that kind of distance of saying, oh, I just need to get an x-ray and get a cast and my arm will heal in a few weeks or something, right? It's like where I can't look at my own mind with any objective difference. So, right. So that becoming a kind of medical question akin to oncology or orthopedic medicine or virology or something, that all again accompanied this shift in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So all of these things are happening around the same time. They all have a kind of political inflection and political basis, as well as a philosophical one and a practical one. So these kind of changes are happening in different spaces and different, not exactly at the same moment, but kind of generally in sync with each other.
The differentiation you make between when something's wrong with the mind as opposed to something wrong with a physical part of the body, that hits home for me because I've got a slight case of OCD or an extreme case of anxiety. I don't know which way you want to put it, but and I take serotonin reuptake and a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor for it. It works well.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried over and over again to come off the medication and just apply the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy to try to work through it. The problem is the very thing that I'm depending on to fix myself is the very thing that's distorted. So as I'm trying to implement the cognitive behavioral strategies, I start to obsess about those. And it becomes where I can't get any separation from myself in order to implement it. However, with a slight dose of the medication, it allows my mind to slow down just enough to where it doesn't stop all symptoms, but it gives me the space that I need to work through it. So, I hope that makes sense to you and, of course, to the listeners. So the emergence of psychiatry, it can't be a coincidence that this comes about during the Enlightenment. Right. So what can you tell me? Did the Enlightenment, what impact does the Enlightenment have on this new way of viewing human thought, human behavior?
You're absolutely right. The connection to the Enlightenment is very strong. And the probably the best way to think about this, or the easiest way to think about it, is to look at the French case, where after all, the Enlightenment has been the kind of dominant mode in thinking and kind of philosophy, and at least in popularization of philosophy over the decades before kind of culminating or reaching crescendo in the French Revolution, 1789. And only a few years after that, we have the new kind of rational, enlightened French state, French Republic. One of the tasks it sets about for itself is to re-examine hospital care and to look at places like asylums, which are at least as they're portrayed, often badly mismanaged, often places where well, let's think about it this way. If you want to understand the project of the French Revolution as spreading enlightenment, spreading reason and clarity, the asylum is kind of the negation of all of that, right? It's dark, it's dingy, literally, and also more philosophically. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding these afflictions and the patients who are, or the people who are suffering from them. So what the French Revolution does is it elevates a person of relatively humble origins, Philippe Pinel, who's a physician, and by putting him in charge of the Bicêtre, the or what we would now call psychiatric hospital, but the facility for taking care of the mad in this is in the 1790s, it it puts this institution in medical hands, right? So in that act of appointing him, it is, and he again, as a person of modest background, not a noble, not a member of the academy, right? So this is also something that the French Revolution and the Enlightenment have done. They've said they've created, at least in theory, a kind of meritocracy, right? So not by virtue of his birth, but talent, this person is put in that position. And what Pinel writes about, and he publishes this treatise on insanity in 1801, and he writes case histories of the patients he encounters in this facility that he's taken over. And he understands madness as a deficit of reason. And this, of course, is not his invention. And he's very aware of some of the work that's being done in Britain at this time and refers to British doctors. And he's also aware of philosophy, particularly British philosophy, like John Locke, who has written about madness as an absence of reason. So that is, in philosophical terms, that is exactly Pinel's starting point. And he, again, building on Locke, he has this idea that, and I'm using this language which is kind of offensive to our ears, mad people, right? But that's those are the terms of the time. That mad people are, according to Locke, they may have there may be a flaw in their reasoning, or they've made incorrect assumptions, and then their logic may be intact, but they're starting in the wrong place. So imagine that by curing people of their delusions, we can just expose them to reason, right? So here under Pinel, this kind of Enlightenment, early psychiatry, again, it's not yet called psychiatry, but what become the ancestor of psychiatry, we have this idea that reason has the remarkable ability to kind of restore people to their senses. So there's very little. I was going to say ironic, although there's probably a better word to describe it. But what's, I think, really intriguing about Pinel is, first of all, he's very humane, and he writes. You can tell he's someone who really cares about the well-being of the patients, and that's not as common as you might think or hope in the history of psychiatry, especially among some of the, quote unquote founding fathers. And then he never says this in some, well, he credits the people who ran the asylum before him, and particularly the wife of the superintendent of the asylum. He gives her credit for being both very, very sympathetic and kind, which he says is necessary for a physician, but also for having a way with patients. And he sort of says that she's got this perfect balance of kindness and firmness, which is necessary for dealing with this kind of population. And when he talks about treatment, there's nothing medical about what he does. It's really just kind of, he tries to dispel people of their delusions. He's not using any kind of what we would understand as a medical treatment, right? And I can go into more detail about what he does if you want. But yeah, he's very much operating in the spirit of the Enlightenment. So it's certainly no coincidence that the Enlightenment is the era that produces psychiatry and modern approaches to mental illness or the mad.
I am interested to know, not just in the case of Pinel, but in treating of psychiatric problems in general, what were some of the ways that they treated people during the 19th century?
Sure. So it's remarkable how eclectic it is. through the 18th century and well into the 19th century, there are still things that were done that had been done for centuries, right? So there, for one, water and moisture are linked to these kinds of conditions in all kinds of ways. So sometimes baths and water, like water cures are recommended. And in some cases, it's literally what it sounds like, but very pleasant, kind of the soothing effect of maybe a hot tub or something like that. But in other cases, the bath is quite unpleasant, and maybe think in terms of blasting people with cold water, streams of cold water, really almost a kind of water torture. So there's a whole kind of cluster of treatments that have to do with water and moisture. There's movement. There had been kind of like these elaborate systems of sort of swings and pulleys set up to kind of restore balance to patients. There are when you get into the 19th century, now again, that this thing which is soon going to be called psychiatry is starting to grow, and there's sort of curricula and systems, people are writing treatises more and more. They start to pay attention to the environment, and they start to say, well, these new mental hospitals, these madhouses, as they're still called, they need to be orderly, right? Because the mind needs to, the disorder and chaos of madness needs to be countered with an orderly environment. So things should be rational and rectilinear, and there should be gardens, fresh air, and the kind of healthful influence of a breeze and a garden and all this stuff. So that the attention to environment is also part of it. And then there are all kinds of potions and different sorts of mixtures cocktails that people are given to drink and consume. Many of them are diuretics because of sort of like discharging the bad bile or what have you. So a lot of these, really pre-modern beliefs linger and are kind of still in practice through the 19th century and even into the 20th century. But what happens in the 19th century is psychiatry starts to become a science in a way that we recognize as science and scientific medicine, right? So if earlier, I mean, there's certainly treatises on how to deal with disruptions of mood or delusions or periodic illnesses, which, sound to us like manic depression or, you mentioned OCD, obsessions have certainly, or, paranoia, all versions of this have been discussed and cataloged back to the ancient Greeks, and are found all over both Western and Islamic medical treatises and so forth. So there's a lot of continuity, in the kinds of symptoms you find. But by the time you get to the 19th century, you get different people trying to come up with diagnostic systems to take this kind of big grab bag of ways of describing madness or mental illness and break it down into basic categories. And you don't have a lot of really great advances in treatment in those years. There's more attention to, at least in the middle of the 19th century, to there's a turn toward neurology, toward trying to understand the roots of mental illness in the brain. There's also a turn toward kind of observing patients, and I can go into more detail in any of this too if you want, observing patients and seeing what the course of their conditions is and how things maybe improve or don't improve over time. There really isn't a whole lot until the later 19th century. There's a kind of boom in psychotherapy, what we call psychotherapy, and hypnosis and suggestion,
The
and a kind of
talking cure,
the
right?
talking cure, exactly right. And of course, Freud is one of many people doing that kind of stuff in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So, that's when you have a kind of this idea, which in some ways harkens back to Pinel from 100 years before, but this idea that you can talk to people and listen to them, and maybe their words will give you a clue to what the problem is. And maybe through, instead of locking them up, putting them in a straitjacket, making them, you know, um, drink a potion that puts them, evacuates their bowels or something, maybe by talking to them, you can make some progress with them. Now, I should say also that treatments are very dependent on social class, right? So the talking cure is not something that, your factory worker or peasant in 1880 has available to them, right?
Right. So like Sigmund Freud, when he's developing his theories, these are based on his largely interactions with upper middle class white women, and he's,
Precisely.
universalizing his theories. Which kind of brings me to my next question is what is the relationship between psychology and psychiatry? You know what I mean? Like how, because psychiatry, like you said, it's medical,
Mhm.
but they have to rely on theories of mind and theories of human behavior. So how do the two connect? And I guess how do they come apart?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The way I would think about it is that in a way, psychology comes more out of philosophy, out of trying to understand the human mind, and psychiatry comes out of medicine. And so they're coming from different places. And for a while, psychiatry isn't particularly interested in psychology because the understanding of the human being is not, it's not really resonant with a more philosophical understanding of the human being. This only really starts to come together in the late 19th century and somewhere around Freud's time as well. So psychology, as I said, had its roots in philosophy, but also tries to establish itself as a science and tries, and of course, so my most of my work is on Germany and Austria, so I tend to see things through that lens. And there being a science means, having an institute at the university, having professorships, having journals with what we now call peer review, and all that process, and a lab to carry out your experiments. And psychology is very much invested in that in the 19th century. So you start to get the establishment of labs for psychology where they are testing reflexes, where they're trying to understand, kind of thinking about human beings as almost machines. You mentioned mechanization, they're the mechanical models before, right?
Sure.
Right. So trying to kind of understand the human being as a system in that way. So there are a few figures by around 1900 who start to combine psychology and psychiatry, but they're coming from different directions. And then of course Freud too was neither a psychologist nor a psychiatrist. Freud was actually a neurologist. So he has this background in sort of trying to understand the nervous system and the the nervous system of simple creatures, of fish. He'd written about early vertebrates and that kind of stuff in some of his early work, and then basically to make a living and be able to get married and have a family, he starts seeing patients and takes in. It's maybe not the thing he's most interested in, but he becomes a kind of like, you go to Freud when you don't feel good and you don't really know why. And, he starts to talk. And then this is kind of where his whole system starts to develop. So he didn't start out intending to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist or any of this, but it kind of develops from. So, I'd say you really have to think about not only psychiatry and psychology, but also neurology and look at these three different currents and when they come together and when they're working independently of each other.
So it sounds to me, right? Because psychiatry, I would have to say, is also rooted in philosophy. It just started to break off earlier on from
Mhm.
Descartes and Locke, and it starts to go more toward your scientific discipline. In psychology, just later on, I guess, in being in Austria, Germany, with Wilhelm, if I'm pronouncing it right, Wilhelm Wundt,
Wundt, yeah. Mhm.
in his theories, and I think Titchener was in America. I'm not positive. So, once they start looking at psychology more as a science, now the psychiatry and psychology kind of come more together. Would that be an accurate way to look at it?
Yeah, that would be accurate. Although psychologists aren't so interested in mental illness yet, they're more interested in kind of understanding the quote unquote normal mind. And whereas psychiatry is much more concerned with, and again, psychiatry I mentioned these asylums, and I think you brought it up to begin with. By the 20th century, most countries, many countries at least, have quite a few asylums. This whole asylum system and mental hospital system has expanded. And psychiatrists are trained in medical schools by this point, and they are then sent out to administer, to run these institutions. It's not really a high prestige job. It's often these are large institutions far away from where you want to be. And they're not there are not a lot of happy endings in these early asylums. They're crowded places. There's not a lot of time to devote to any individual patient, right? So the psychiatrist is kind of like a low status profession still, whereas psychologists are much more so. Even in the early 20th century, you don't go to a psychologist to talk about your feelings. You don't go to a psychologist because you're not, doing well. They might not be brought in to look at children yet or adolescents, all the stuff we think of today when we think of psychology, right? They're still running their labs where they're trying to kind of understand, how does memory work, in the quote unquote normal person, and not looking at pathology quite as much yet.
So, what have been some of the main challenges to psychiatry? I don't, I mean, obstacles to its growth, yes, but also I'm thinking of Thomas Saz, for instance. Saz, who was a psychiatrist, basically says that the whole premise behind psychiatry is wrong, that there can be no mental illness. So, how has, what, in other words, so what obstacles have there been in how has somebody like a Saz or an R.D. Lang affected the discipline?
Yeah, absolutely. So there, as you said, there are a lot of obstacles, but I would say on one side there are obstacles, but then there's opposition, right? And opposition, you identified two key figures whom we would generally group into the category of anti-psychiatrists or anti-psychiatry, even though most of them would not have used that label for themselves, and most of them didn't really think that they belonged in the same conversation. They don't really work together in any sense. But Saz, who is of Hungarian origin originally, but did most of his work in the US, Lang, who is Scottish and worked primarily in the UK, are two of the key figures who really emerged in the 1960s and 70s. And I suppose you could also lump in Michel Foucault in France as a third key figure in articulating a really serious critique of psychiatry, both as a kind of knowledge about the self and illness, and as a praxis. So I guess let's say Saz mounts, as you described accurately, really a philosophical critique of the idea of madness or mental illness, which, and his argument is, I think I can, and he wrote quite a lot, but I think I can give you a fairly quick synopsis, which is to say, that we, again, coming back to where I started with the difference between a mental illness and a physical illness or disease. In the case of mental illness, we construct norms to, right, because mental illness is diagnosed through behavior, through the way somebody acts, the words someone utters, right? They're not fitting in, they're potentially harming themselves or harming the people around them. These are the ways we identify a mental illness. Whereas if you go to the doctor because your arm hurts and they take an x-ray and they find a fracture, they find that fracture, right? And they have an explanation and a cause and therefore a course of treatment. But there's no equivalent, there's no lesion, right? If we just put you in a CAT scan or something and, we like, oh, that's why you're acting that way. This lobe is a lobe. And of course, there were attempts to do that. And we could get into lobotomy if you want to talk about that as one particularly dark episode in the history of psychiatry. But so Zaz's point is that we don't, we construct norms through behavior, and that is just a kind of a socially constructed notion of what is normal and therefore what is healthy, rather than existing in some kind of biological reality. So the whole system of psychiatry is then called into question as being on a shoddy philosophical basis. And Foucault, I mean, is coming from a different place, but there's certainly some overlap. And Foucault really, for one, and he's of course was attacked a lot for this, but he mounts a pretty, I think, penetrating critique of the Enlightenment when he says that by kind of orienting our societies around reason, we have, and the kind of parallel act to that is that we've taken the mad people away and institutionalized them. And what does medicine do? It doesn't really do anything medical. It tries to get them to understand that they are mad, and right to see themselves that way. But what we've done is we've impoverished our culture. We've, um, we've and again I'm kind of butchering him a little bit here, but if you'll indulge me, he attributes this in part to a kind of operation of power that is sometimes, depending on when he wrote it and what you happen to be reading, it's about capitalism, it's about the modern state, it's about the professions and the way the professions kind of exert their power over us and get us to internalize certain norms about, how we should be acting. And instead of like, he draws a lot on this idea of the panopticon, the prison where the warden has this ability to surveil the entire prison population,
Okay,
right?
you brought up the panopticon, so I'm going
Yes,
to need you to elaborate a little bit on Bentham's master plan to deal with prisoners, which was the panopticon. So
exactly right.
what was it?
Right. So the panopticon is exactly as you said. It goes back to um, Bentham's notion of what a prison should look like back in the early mid 19th century, and that the idea is that we need to be able to watch the prisoners and make sure that they're not up to anything they shouldn't be, and so by putting this kind of observation center in the middle and creating all of the prison cells around it, this gives kind of maximum ability to surveil and to watch the prison population, which for Foucault, what that really is doing is it's not that you're literally, if you're in the prison, it's not that you're literally being watched at any moment, but you could be being observed at any moment. So you internalize this sense that you're being watched, and then it becomes no longer the warden or the guard or the police watching you, rather you watching yourself and keeping yourself in line, right? And so that's this kind of disciplinary action that's a kind of metaphor for what the modern state does to us. It's like your sexuality, your morality, all needs to be circumscribed by this set of strictures. So that, I think, for Foucault, it works again as a very powerful metaphor for what psychiatry is doing. It's telling us to watch ourselves and making us very self-conscious, in that way. And then, with Lang, you have a kind of slightly different mode of, I would say, trying to, and he's again not the only one who does this, but sort of trying to see the schizophrenic as, again, not a malady, not a condition to be cured, but a state to be understood. And he's one of a kind of whole lineage of people who believe that there's a certain wisdom in madness, which, I think to our sensibility today seems terribly exploitative. But that, in the kind of, if you've heard someone, let's just say there's somebody who's probably a schizophrenic who's gone off their meds and they're on the corner and they're ranting and raving about something. Most of us just walk by and we think that's someone who, needs treatment, and I feel bad for them and I wish they would take their medication. But for Lang, there's the content of their words could be important. He also encourages the artistic expression and has schizophrenic patients painting and making art. Of course, he was breaking, he was he lived with a bunch of patients and was kind of violating the norms of medical practice as we understand them today, and even as they were understood at the time, of course. But I would say Lang fits in much more with this kind of romanticization idea that there's which has also religious roots, that madness is in earlier periods it might be understood as, a God or a divinity speaking through us. And so again, Lang wants to say, let's listen and let's see what wisdom there might be. And of course, there are people who are much more reputable medically who also say, let's listen to the words. Even serious psychotic patients can be. I'm thinking here of Ellen Sachs, who is at actually USC, my university, who's a law professor who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when she was in law school, and has become a specialist around issues of the law and mental illness. And Ellen Sachs has, she writes in her memoir and in other places about how she still sees a psychoanalyst.
How do you
And
spell that?
It's Sakselyn. She's really, really brilliant, brilliant scholar in
Okay.
person.
I
Um,
definitely have to look her up. I
yeah.
remember, I believe it was a book by Artie Lang. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but it's called Sanity, Madness, and the Family. And I read it about, I don't know, 23 years ago. And I'll never forget this story that he told about that this family has him come in and they have a schizophrenic member of the family. So they're all in the other room except for the schizophrenic guy. And they're in there, and they're telling this like, he's this, he's that, he does this, he does that. And he's paranoid. He always thinks we're in another room talking about him.
Hmm.
And he says, well, aren't you? And that always stuck with me. It was funny. Like they're saying he's nuts. He thinks we're in another room talking about him, but you are in the other room talking. You know what I mean?
There you have it. Yeah.
So how where is psychiatry right now as a discipline, as a profession? I mean, so what are the good points in terms of how far it's come, and where is there still a lot of room for growth, or areas where it's still really lagging behind as a medical discipline?
Mm. Well, that's a great question. I'll answer part of it and I'll defer to people who have medical training for some of it, I think, because I don't want to overstep my own expertise. But I would say
It's
that
2024. Everybody speaks.
everyone's an
Everyone's an
expert
expert on
today.
everything.
Yeah, well, I'm old, so I'm shy about, claiming expertise. But yeah, no, I would say one area where things have really progressed is the stigma around mental illness, I think has been removed to a great extent. Now, it's not completely gone, as you know, but there are at least many spaces where it's safe to talk about what your struggles and your treatment regimen, your medication, whatever it may be. And in earlier eras, that would be, I think, let's just imagine, trying to marry somebody or trying to get a job when you have a history of being treated for mental illness. That would be really a deal breaker in so many cases in the past. So I think, where we as a society, we talk openly about our trauma, and I've written about trauma, and I think, of course, it's a great thing that we can talk about it. Sometimes I feel like we trivialize it a little bit, and we were all traumatized. Although I suppose after the pandemic and a lot of other things that have happened, maybe we really are all traumatized. But it's become at a certain point when we all have been through a trauma, when do those things like war and sexual violence, those things that I hold up as really what the real definitions of traumatic experiences, when do we kind of cheapen that a little bit? I don't know. I'll leave that to others. But so I think, in some ways, I think we would also have to talk about pharmacology. You mentioned that earlier, taking pills. That the field of psychiatry has been revolutionized over the last 50 years by various generations of medications that can alleviate, of course, depression, OCD, um, uh, psychoses, in schizophrenia, many other conditions. So there, you know, again, like so many other things, it's not just black and white, right? I mean, medication has brought enormous relief to so many people. On the other hand, it has side effects that are questionable sometimes. It has enriched pharmaceutical companies in staggering ways sometimes. That the pharmaceutical companies in the insurance industry, you ask for things that could be improved. I think the role of industry and insurance in kind of dictating what treatments get developed and rolled out and when they get developed and rolled out, that in an ideal world, I think there would be more checks on that kind of power. So I think that I guess one other thing I'll mention is, since we've talked about the asylum and the mental hospital, the asylum is no longer that kind of presence in our society, really, since the 1960s, and kind of culminating in the 70s and early 80s. We had this process of deinstitutionalization, which is not just an American thing. It was really kind of a global global process where the institutions were emptied out. And again, some of this was made possible because of medication and because of counseling centers, and there's much more access to support and clinics. And so we've had this whole kind of sector of society that didn't exist before World War II, or barely existed, right? That's, become really fully developed. There are all sorts of treatment centers, counseling centers, psychologists, social workers. It's there, but we didn't do a really good job of making sure the people who were in the institutions got to the treatment. We didn't, right? We kind of leave people to themselves, and that's one of the many things that's kind of fed into this terrible crisis of homelessness, that we deal with right now. So every good development seems to also come with some unpleasant effects, and I think that's just the way it is.
So I have a funny story, but I want to preface it with, I wonder how psychiatry is viewed by the rest of the medical profession. And here's why. And the story I'm going to tell actually doesn't bode well for the rest of the medical profession, at least not in prison anyway. I don't know out here, but years ago, I was incarcerated and I was getting really bad panic attacks. I didn't know that they were panic attacks. I just thought I was sick. I had no idea. And as a result of the panic attacks, I was getting a lot of anxiety. I was getting tension and having wicked headaches. So I go to medical and I explain it to them, and they say it's not a medical issue. You have to go to mental health. So I went to see the mental health people. They said, no, it's a physical problem. You have to go to back to medical. So I go back to medical. Medical says, no, you have to go see mental health. So I went to mental health. Finally, I found the psychiatrist that knew what he was doing, and he explained to me, no, you're having panic attacks. And he knew exactly what they were. So he put me on medication for the panic attacks. They worked. The medication worked. I still got the headaches. So I wrote back to medical. I said, I'm still getting the headaches. I go to see the doctor, and the doctor tells me, you're getting these headaches because of all that crap medication you're on. And I'm saying, wait a second. I had the headaches before I was on the medication. You told me to go see psychiatry. I did, got on the medication, and now you first of all, it was ridiculous what he was saying, but really what I want to have you comment on is just the disdain he seemed to have for the entire idea of psychiatry and psychiatric medications. Now, like I said, this was in prison. This is 2000, maybe 2001. So, I mean, that's a long time ago. But is that the case? Is there still sort of not just a stigma with mental health, but a stigma on psychiatry within the medical field?
Absolutely. And I think psychiatry, the stigma, I don't know why this is the case, but the stigma of mental illness somehow also applies to the people who treat mental illness in a way, right? So psychiatry, this is one of the themes I emphasize when I teach the history of psychiatry. It's really struggled for its whole existence with this kind of lack of prestige and lack of status. And, neurology doesn't have this problem, right? Nobody thinks twice about, the neurologist, but I think psychiatry still has this reputation of being a bit of a hack field, whatever it is that psychiatrists are doing. And it also being sort of, pill pushers is also not something that's right. So, and I think that's what the doctor who told you this was kind of reflecting, right? This prejudice against psychiatrists. They just give you a lot of pills, and of course that's going to make you feel bad. I think, that this isn't exactly what you asked, but to me, one of the lessons here is that the mind and the body are interrelated in, all kinds of ways, and we try to separate them out. We do it in the way we talk about it, and in the different medical specializations we go to. But I think, there's obviously for a while now been a movement toward a more holistic approach to healing into the body. And of course, sometimes this draws on non-Western ideas appropriately. But I think, yeah, I mean, we try to separate it off and just say, this is this is bothering you, go see that doctor. But in reality, these are all systems which are interconnected. So, we need to pay attention to our minds and our bodies and the connections between them all the time.
Excellent point. All right, before I let you go, is there anything we didn't cover that we should have in the history of psychiatry?
I mean, we could leave lobotomy for another day, I guess. We could leave.
Watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, we could, I guess another thing I would talk about is how a diagnosis works, and, how the kind of I'll just say a couple words. I won't I won't strain anyone's patience too much, but we, as I'm sure you know, we have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where we have, which is our sort of, it's always called the Bible, right, of psychiatric diagnoses. And the DSM has grown over the years, and every few years there's an update, and every X number of years there's a new edition. But I think what is, to me, what's interesting about the DSM is you can kind of see, if you go back to the 1950s, to the earliest ones, you can see how assumptions about these conditions change over time. And you can see, for example, in the early ones, how psychoanalysis, a kind of Freudianism, which was really ascendant in American medicine after World War II, how there's a Freudian language for talking about everything. And by 1980, the Freudians lost out to the neo-Kraepelinians, which is this other school of mental medicine, of psychiatry, which is much less interested in Oedipal complexes,
He
and
coined the term dementia praecox, right? Emil Kraepelin.
okay, you're very well informed.
um, the Freudian influence. I think it's a good thing that gone are the days of childhood masturbatory disorder, right? Like it's a good thing that
I
no one's
think
looking at that any longer as an
I'm a real,
illness.
I'm a real fan of Freud, but I think, not when it comes to psychiatric diagnoses. I see him much more he's much more helpful to me in kind of thinking about our culture and thinking much more, I think he was a gift to the humanities. I don't know if he was necessarily a gift to medicine.
Okay, where can people find you? You got to have a website or a blog or something, a podcast maybe.
Well, I do podcasts where I talk to other people about their work. But so you won't find, I do it through the New Books Network. In fact, I recorded one this morning. But you won't find much about me through that. You can find me through USC, where I teach, and um, apologize for that background noise there.
I didn't hear anything.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, you can find me through USC in the history department, the Van Hannick history department, where I've been teaching for a while, and where I am now the chair. And I wrote a book about shell shock and trauma in the German army and German society, which is called Hysterical Men. So you can take a look at that. I also wrote a book about department stores in German history as a topic in German Jewish history and cultural history, and that's called The Consuming Temple. You can check that out. And I tweet at or I post on X at least
X.
occasionally. I
We don't
X, or
know. No
whatever
one
they
knows
call
what
it
it's called
now,
anymore.
yeah, at PF Lerner, although I don't know how much longer I'll be on that platform.
Yeah, it's a cesspool. I
Exactly.
hope I don't get sued for that, but I guess truth is a
Well,
defense
I'll
to
go down with
slander.
you in that case because I couldn't agree more.
All right. Thank you very much for a very enlightening conversation. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, let me know what you think. Your likes, your dislikes, leave your comments. Till next time.